Spitfire vs. Bf-109, the dogfight that won the war in the summer of 1940. Britain was on the ropes. The German war machine had steamrolled France in weeks, and now it stood coiled on the opposite shore, ready to launch the invasion of Britain. Operation Sea Lion. It all felt inevitable, but there was a catch. Before any invasion barges could cross the English Channel, Germany had to control the sky. And that meant getting through a thin line of defense, flown by young men in some of the most advanced fighting machines of the day. This is the story of two of those machines, absolute legends of the air: the British supermarine Spitfire and the German Messerschmitt Bf-109. It is a story about more than just aluminum and steel. It's about a high-stakes duel that would shape the fate of nations, fought by pilots who pushed themselves and their aircraft to the absolute limit. This is the story of the dogfight that helped win the war. By July 1940, the situation looked grim. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, was tasked with one single objective: smash the Royal Air Force and gain total air superiority over southern England. Their pilots were confident, combat-hardened, and flying one of the world's most formidable fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf-109. Facing them was the RAF's fighter command. They were outnumbered and still recovering from brutal losses over France. But they had a home field advantage and a secret weapon: a revolutionary air defense network, built around radar and ground control. Still, the burden ultimately fell on two key fighters: the Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire. While the tough, reliable Hurricane, which made up the majority of RAF squadrons, was often sent to tackle the waves of German bombers, the sleek Spitfire was handed the job of apex predator. Its mission: to hunt the bombers' deadly escorts, the Bf-109s. The clash was coming. The skies over the fields of Kent and the waters of the Channel were about to become a brutal arena for two of Europe's finest fighters. The sharp end of the Luftwaffe spear was the Messerschmitt Bf-109, designed by Willy Messerschmitt. This plane was all about speed and packing a punch. It was a small, lightweight fighter, and its notoriously narrow landing gear made it a handful on takeoff and landing. But in the air, it was a killer. The 109 had some serious advantages. Its Daimler-Benz DB601 engine used direct fuel injection, a huge technological leap, while a Spitfire's engine, with its gravity-fed carburetor, could sputter and die under negative G-forces. The 109 could just shove its nose down and dive away from trouble without missing a beat. This let German pilots control the fight. Using boom and zoom tactics, diving from above, guns blazing, then escaping in a dive the Spitfire couldn't immediately copy. Its armament was also terrifying. While early models like the E1 used only machine guns, the common E3 and E4 variants that fought over Britain carried two machine guns plus two 20mm cannons in the wings. Those cannons fired explosive shells that could shred a Spitfire with just a handful of hits, a much bigger punch than the 8 rifle-caliber machine guns on the early The Luftwaffe pilots, many of them veterans of the Spanish Civil War and the Battle of France, were sure they'd make short work of the RAF. But the 109 had a fatal flaw: its fuel tank. It was designed as a short-range interceptor, not a long-haul escort. By the time a Bf-109 reached London from its base in France, the pilot was already glancing at his fuel gauge. He had maybe 10 to 15 minutes of actual combat time before he had to turn for home. This was a crippling weakness, tying the fighters to the bombers and blunting their deadly effectiveness. If the Bf-109 was a dagger, the Spitfire was a fencer's rapier. It was the masterpiece of designer R.J. Mitchell, who tragically worked himself to death perfecting it. The Spitfire is instantly recognizable for its gorgeous, elliptical wings. But those wings weren't just for looks. They gave the aircraft an incredible blend of low drag at high speed and jaw-dropping maneuverability. In a turning dogfight, the Spitfire was the undisputed king. German tactical manuals practically screamed at their pilots not to get into a turning fight with a Spitfire, and RAF pilots knew this was their turf. The Spitfire had an edge in turning ability over the Bf 109, allowing a skilled pilot to get on his opponent's tail and stay there. This strength in the horizontal was the perfect answer to the 109's advantage in the vertical. At the start of the battle, around 19 squadrons of Spitfire Mk.s were ready to fight. These early models hit speeds of 360 miles per hour and were a solid match for the Bf 109, especially below 20,000 feet. But the Spitfire wasn't perfect. As mentioned, the carburetor couldn't handle negative G dives. At its first armament of 8 303 caliber machine guns just didn't have the knockout power of the German cannons. Damaged German bombers were known to limp home looking like Swiss cheese, riddled with hundreds of small bullet holes. And while elegant, the Spitfire was more complex to build and repair than its workhorse partner, the Hurricane. But in the right hands, the Spitfire felt less like a machine and more like an extension of the pilot's own will, responsive, agile, and inspiring a level of confidence that was worth more than any spec sheet. The technical specs tell one part of the story, but this battle was ultimately won by the pilots. Understanding their tactics, their fears, and their incredible bravery is what brings this history to life. If you're finding this story of courage and innovation compelling, take a second to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video. Now, let's get back to the duel in the sky. When these two thoroughbreds clashed, the fight often came down to which pilot could play to his aircraft's strengths. It was a lethal game of chess at over 300 miles per hour. A German pilot in his Bf 109 wanted to start the fight from above. He'd use the sun to hide his approach, dive on a Spitfire formation with cannons firing, and then use that fuel-injected engine to dive away before anyone knew what hit them. The RAF pilots quickly came up with a counter. They de-rolled their planes upside down and pulled back on the stick, creating positive Gs to keep the fuel flowing to the Merlin engine as they followed the dive. But if the German pilot made a mistake and let the fight slow down into a turning battle, the tables flipped. A Spitfire pilot would try to bait the 109 into a horizontal dogfight, using his tighter turn to bleed the German speed and slide into a firing position. German aces knew this was a trap. Their own test pilots admitted the Spitfire was better in the turns. Even the famous German ace, Adolf Galland, when asked by Hermann Gring what he needed to win, supposedly quipped, "I should like an outfit of Spitfires for my squadron." Tactics evolved on both sides. The RAF ditched its rigid pre-war formations for the more flexible German Finger 4, which offered better protection. The pilots themselves were a mix of veterans and kids fresh out of training, many barely out of their teens. In the end, a pilot's skill, his eyesight, and his aggression often mattered more than any slight performance difference. Post-war analysis shows that RAF claims were often inflated in the heat of battle, as were German claims, but there's no denying the bravery on both sides. The Bf 109's Achilles heel was its range. It simply couldn't stay and fight long enough to truly protect the German bombers. As the battle dragged on, this became a catastrophic problem for the Luftwaffe. RAF controllers could send squadrons to intercept, knowing the enemy fighters were on the clock. Spitfires were fighting over their own turf. If they ran low on fuel, they could land, rearm, and be back in the fight. If an RAF pilot bailed out, he could be flying another plane the next day. A downed Luftwaffe pilot was out of the war for good. The climax arrived on September 15, 1914, now known as Battle of Britain Day. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had at London, convinced fighter command was broken. Instead, they were met by a massive, coordinated, and furious defense. The sight of large RAF formations, including the controversial Big Wings, shocked German aircrews who'd been told the British were finished. The losses they suffered that day were devastating and simply unsustainable. The duel had been won. Hitler postponed the invasion indefinitely. The Spitfire, a short-range interceptor fighting over its home, had beaten the Bf 109, a short-range interceptor forced into a role it was never built for. The Battle of Britain wasn't won by the Spitfire alone. The victory rested on the shoulders of many, the greater numbers of Hawker Hurricanes that took on the bombers, the tireless ground crews who patched up battered planes, and the genius of the Dowding system that directed them. But in the contest for the sky, the duel between the Spitfire and the Bf 109 was the main event. The Spitfire, with its masterful mix of speed and agility, proved to be the right tool for the job. Over the skies of southern England, it met its rival head-on, and came out on top not through overwhelming superiority, but with better strategy, the courage of its pilots, and the simple, profound advantage of defending home. The Spitfire became more than just a plane. It became a symbol of defiance, a legend forged in the crucible of combat. The fate of the free world rested on the pilots of fighter command. And in the immortal words of Winston Churchill, never was so much owed by so many to the few. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more stories from the crossroads of history and technology, make sure you're subscribed. We'll see you in the next one.